Ghost, the Bootlegger's Horse by Saras Sparks, Part 4. As Hetty put it, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So one morning in early October, Trail went into town. The morning that Trail pulled up outside the store, George had been staring out the window as he usually did, making a half-hearted attempt at organizing the shelves when the bell rang. He perked up when he saw who it was and cleaned his hands on his apron. "Hey there, Trail. How's everything with you? You need some sugar?" George had heard the news of Kip and figured all things were still going strong for Trail, so he was surprised when Trail shook his head. "Not today, George, but I've been wondering about something. I got a proposition for you. How about a coffee and a slice of that pie?" George delightedly brought both, excited about any opportunity for conversation. With that, Trail sat down on a hogshead and put the coffee on a nail keg and balanced the pie plate on his knee. George leaned his elbows on the counter, listening intently as Trail began to outline a plan that might work for both of them. At first, George was hesitant, but the more Trail talked, the more it all made sense. Trail would do all the ordering, manage the books, and do repairs on the building. He could do all the heavy lifting and all the boring work that George detested. George could manage the counter and greet the customers. Trail suggested that maybe they could also include a small bakery, perhaps a little sit-down corner where people could have their coffee and pie. Hetty's preserves and jams and jellies would make a great addition to bringing people in. Maybe add in knitted goods, selling items, bolts of cloth and such. "You mean business partners?" asked George. "Yup, that's what I'm thinking," said Trail. "I got a bit set aside to buy my share." If it had been anyone but Trail to suggest this, George would not have considered it. But George knew Trail to be honest, and what he was suggesting might actually work well for both of them. "Let me think on it," said George. "Take your time," said Trail. George helped Trail load his wagon up with a few supplies that Hetty wanted, and they both wore huge smiles as they waved goodbye. Then George went back up the steps and shut the door. "Well," he thought, "you just never know which way the wind is going to blow." All the way home, Trail went over all the ideas he presented to George. Trail's mind was so busy, he was pulling into the cabin's clearing in what seemed no time at all. Hetty saw him from the window and came out. "How'd it go?" she asked. "I think it went pretty good." "Even the part about moving in on 'em, with all our stuff, chickens and goats and the cat?" "Well," Trail cleared his throat, "that was a bit of a hard sell. But after a bit, we worked out where we'd all stay so we weren't tripping over each other. I think you'll be happy for the company, to tell you the truth. I think he's been kind of lonely with handling it all by himself. Yep, I think he's going to say yes. What about you, Hetty? You still set on it?" Hetty nodded. "Yes, Trail, I'm set on it. I think it's going to be a good move. Now we got to tell Cake and Buttons." "Yeah, that's not going to be easy. Not easy for either of us. They're like family. I'm going to miss them terrible," said Trail. "So am I," agreed Hetty. "We'll talk to them tomorrow." When Trail told Cake and Buttons the deal he'd made with George, they really didn't know what to think. Had their good friends lost their minds? "Well, that's just crazy, Trail. What are we going to do without you?" But after a bit and a lot of talking, Trail and Hetty assured them that they wouldn't lose touch and that change was upon them. "I still don't like it," grumbled Cake after Trail and Hetty left. "Me either, Cake," Buttons answered. "But sometimes you just gotta make choices and hope for the best. Hetty's right. We'll still see each other, just not quite as much as we used to." Trail went into town the following week. George had seen him from the window and went out to meet him at the door. Trail didn't even have time to ask what he'd decided. "I think it's a good plan, Trail," George said, smiling. He held out his hand and they shook. "I'd like to move in before winter," said Hetty, when Trail got back with the news. "But that would only give us a couple of weeks," he exclaimed. "How can we possibly manage that?" Trail thought there was just too much to do, until Hetty pointed out their few belongings would probably fit on the wagon. They could put the goats and chickens with Cake and Buttons until they were ready to get them. I've got it all worked out. Don't you mind. You've done your end of the business. Now I'll do mine. We'll move next week. Trail knew better than to argue. He'd put a wheel in motion, and Hetty was bound to make it roll as fast as possible. She was like that. No point putting off till tomorrow what you can do today. Cake and Buttons and the kids came up on the big day. They all pitched in, and the move went fast. Hetty, of course, was right. They didn't have much. They would take the bed and the rugs that Hetty's mother had made and the pots and pans. In the end, there was even room for the goats and chickens and rooster. Hetty stood in the doorway taking a last look inside. This had been their home since they were first married. Trail had built it. "There's a lot of memories here," said Buttons, who was standing with her. "We'll make more memories," Hetty said. "There's no point in getting all boo-hoo about it." She turned the key in the door and looked at her friend. "Trail can use it when he comes up to hunt. We can stay here when we come up to visit. It's not like we won't use it." Hetty hesitated on the porch. They were missing something, but she couldn't put a finger on it. Then it came to her. "Where's the cat? She disappeared when we started moving things around." "Don't you worry about Kitty," said Cake. "We'll keep an eye out for her. It's not like you're leaving for Timbuktu, you know. She'll take care of herself. That barn has a lot of mice in it." Cake and Buttons gave their friends big hugs as they got up into the wagon. With a few tears and lots of waving, they watched as Trail and Hetty were about to pull out of the lane, when who should come flying down the road to hop in with them but the gray cat. She sat on Hetty's lap and purred the whole way. When Hetty first took in the back rooms of the store, she was pleasantly surprised. Although George was not a shopkeep, he had kept everything cleaned and dusted. George said he would live in the attic upstairs. Trail and Hetty could take the rooms below. It would be slightly cramped quarters, but they'd make it work for now. George actually looked forward to having some company. Hetty and Trail found their rooms comfy and cozy, as Hetty put it. She arranged their things so that it all looked familiar. Ghost liked his new stall in the old barn out back. There was about the same amount of pasture as he had in the hills. Shan't and Won't were already into whatever they could find. It felt like home. Within weeks, Hetty and George had reorganized the shelves. Hetty put up all her jams, jellies, and pickles. Customers began coming in. Everyone remarked how good the place looked. People seemed to buy more than they'd planned. Seemed that Hetty had a gift for sales. Cake and Buttons missed their friends terribly, even though they visited often as they could. One evening after they'd come back from town, they were sitting on the porch watching the children playing. Buttons turned to her husband and said, "I think they got it right." "How so?" said Cake. "That move. They got it right. And you know something? It could be right for us, too. There's a school in town. The young'uns are in need of some book learning. And you know how worried I get that another varmint might come in the yard when I'm not around. Claire's 14, nearly 15. She'll be wanting to meet some fellas soon. You could find a place to set up shop. Do your blacksmith and carry harness and do all the repairs. I think we could make a go of it." Cake had learned a long time ago that if Buttons had an idea, it was usually right. So although the thought of moving scared him half to death, he nodded and swallowed hard. "Whatever you think, dear." The next trip to town, they told Trail and Hetty their plans. "We'll help you get started," said Hetty excitedly. "I know a place just down the street that the bank took. It's got the right amount of room for all of you. Cake, you can do your smithing out back of here until you're settled. We'll fix up the barn and make a room." They spent the evening talking until it was too late to go home. The kids had already fallen asleep, so Hetty got them some blankets and Cake and Buttons bunked out on the floor. The next morning, George cooked up pancakes and everyone helped him doing the dishes and cleaning up. After the family had gone, George was tidying up and looked a bit preoccupied. Trail noticed that and said, "Something on your mind there, George?" George turned to him with a worried look and cautiously asked, "They won't all be staying here, will they?" Trail burst out laughing. "Save us, I should certainly hope not. No, I expect Cake is a bit more tucked away like I did. "Don't worry, George. We won't be bunking up with 8 more bodies. There's barely enough room to swing a cat." George breathed a huge sigh of relief. It was big enough for the 3 of them, but no more. Although Cake and Buttons knew they wouldn't be able to make the move until early spring the following year, they got the house down the street that fall and used the time to get prepared. The place was small, but they decided the large front room would work as a little shop for harness repairs and some leather goods. As Hetty suggested, Cake could use Trail's barn for the smithing. In time, he would move that part of the business behind their new place. With all the planning, the winter flew by, in spite of the snow and cold. For Hal, it was back to the same routine, locking up vagrants and petty crooks, sometimes dealing with angry spouses. It seemed that nothing much changed, except for Black Diamond. What a horse! He was saving up for that fancy buggy he'd seen in the livery stable. He didn't mind riding him, but Hal felt he'd look more refined seated in a carriage. He also was thinking that a patent leather harness would really show off Black Diamond as the elegant horse he was. Black Diamond adored his new owner. As soon as he smelt the lavender roses, his ears would go forward. He eagerly waited for his beloved human to come and give him a sugar cube. Hal made sure the livery owner kept him brushed and curried till he shone. When Hal took him out, Black Diamond arched his neck and kept his tail high. Hal was, as always, impeccably dressed. The horse and his new owner were like peas in a pod. That fall day, Hal was daydreaming about Black Diamond pulling the fancy buggy and wondering how he'd be able to afford it when a quick knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. The front desk officer stuck his head in. "Someone to see you, sir. A Mr. Brigsley. Says he's a lawyer." "A lawyer?" said Hal, surprised. There was no one in lockup at present. "Who for?" "Says he's here for you, sir." "Send him in, then." Hal was intrigued. A short, fat, busy little man bustled in. He wore a bowler hat and carried a briefcase. "Brigsley, attorney at law," he said, as he plunked down the briefcase on Hal's desk, took off his hat, and sat down. "I am the executor of your great-aunt Gladys Hornsby Macpherson." "Pardon me," said Hal. "I don't recall having an aunt." "Well, you do, and she's dead, and you get everything." Brigsley was rifling through the briefcase and pulled out a file. "It's all here. You just need to sign a few papers." For once in his life, Hal, who prided himself on never being caught off guard, was caught off guard completely. Puzzled, he read the letter. "My dearest Halford, if you are reading this, it means that I have passed beyond the veil. As I have no other living relatives, I'm bequeathing my entire estate to you. This will serve as my last will and testament. Your loving aunt, Gladys Hornsby Macpherson." Hal, his eyebrows raised, looked across at the lawyer. "Everything is in order, it seems," said the attorney, and handed him the documents to sign. "This will make you a very wealthy man." Then he stood up and put on his hat. "Good day to you, sir. I'll see myself out." For about an hour, Hal didn't move. Not a muscle. He didn't even blink. Suddenly he sprang to his feet, walked briskly into the front office of the station, and announced, "I've decided to retire." Then, as everyone sat in stunned silence, he strode out of the door and practically ran to the livery stable. Hal had never heard of Aunt Gladys, but he would thank her every day for his good fortune. Hal's days of being a policeman stuck in a stuffy office were behind him. He was a real gentleman now. The new buggy was perfect, as was the patent leather harness that Hal had dreamed of. It seemed that even Black Diamond knew how good he looked when he hitched up for a spin around town. He lifted his hooves high and tossed his head proudly as if to say, "Look at me, aren't I handsome?" That summer and on into autumn, Hal took his fancy horse and buggy everywhere he could. He even bought himself a new suit and hat. He loved the attention they attracted going around town. Just as he imagined, they were turning heads. While the days were still warm, they meandered country roads, enjoying the fresh air and quiet. Sometimes they stopped by the shaded groves, a stream or a pond. Hal would just let Black Diamond graze while he passed a pleasant afternoon doing absolutely nothing at all. Hal knew that as the days grew shorter and the leaves of autumn let go of the trees, that winter would soon be moving in once more. These pleasant outings would be over once the white sparkling snow covered the frozen ground. With the quiet of winter, Hal realized that although he was enjoying his retirement, without something to do, he'd soon be bored. Hal was not one to do nothing. He liked being busy. What was he going to do now?